Hello everyone, Navi Ramran here from Tech and Learning. Thank you for attending today's Tech and Learning Future Proofing Your District Plan Conference. Special thank you to our sponsors, Catch-On, Classcraft, FileWave, Global Teletherapy, GradeCam, Sanford Programs, and thank you to all of our association partners. Today's virtual conference is focused on taking the lessons learned from current remote learning programs to create long-term plans that support effective teaching and learning both online and in person. I want to remind everyone to log into your conference hub using the link sent in your confirmation email. Once you are logged in, you can visit a sponsor booth to learn about their offerings and book a meeting or live chat with them. See your personalized agenda, network with over 1,000 of today's attendees via the registrant directory and chat features, and access all of the conference resources in the download section. You also have the opportunity to win prizes throughout the conference hub. You will find several buttons to enter yourself into the passport to prizes. Please visit all of the pages using the navigation bar on the top of the page. Every time you find a button, you will fill in a form. You will earn one entry into the raffle. All entries are eligible for a series of drawings, only one prize per participant. You can enter once for every button you find. We will announce winners via email at the end of the conference. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions for presenters during the webinar, please submit them through the Zoom chat feature. Please know we capture all questions and our presenters are happy to answer them as time permits. Today's slides and additional resource materials are available and may be accessed within the Downloads tab. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. Be sure to use the conference hashtag TLTechLive in any of your social posts. Please join me in thanking our terrific speakers who have kindly agreed to spend some time with all of us today. I also want to thank each and every one of you for joining us and spending this time together. Please join me in welcoming our presenters, Susan Gentz and Chris Draper. Susan and Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen here for everyone. So today we're talking about future-proofing for special education supports. The first big fundamental that we need to all sort of agree on is that virtual and blended learning is coming at us like a wave. It's inevitable, we can see it coming, and there's still time to catch it and ride it. This doesn't have to be a scary problem. Although a lot of the pieces that affect special education are unique. There's a lot of really, really cool tools that are available, things we could do if we're starting from scratch and thinking, oh, well, all the avatars, all the different virtual rooms and everything else that's available. Tons of cool stuff. With special ed, though, there has to be an important balance between that access and legal sensitivity. This is where we need to be a bit more thoughtful and where some of the problems that we'll see can feel a little overwhelming because some of the details can often be complicated. However, evaluating the issues that are relevant to that balance does not require, doesn't require a PhD of rocket science or anything else. It really requires thoughtful attention to detail. What we mean by that is the first thing everyone is going to be telling you about is it's all about cybersecurity. We got to worry about hacking, and this is the only thing that's of concern. It's the making sure that every computer has a special piece of software that connects it all. It's the two-factor stuff. It's the multiplexing and the word soup of everything that goes on. And those pieces are important. I'm not trying to downplay them at all. They're very important aspects that CIOs need to be aware of, especially with the way software is now built, distributed, employed. What we're seeing is it isn't just like getting an old CD and loading it onto a Dell computer anymore. We have a lot of complex interactions that, depending on how you purchase the software, it depends on how that data flows, who holds it, depending on what type of tools that you connect it to is going to actually dictate a good bit, what other third-party apps hold not only processes, but data is there, who shares. The issue between COPA and your FERPA responsibilities, making sure that when a company of a software you're using is setting things up to ensure access for students at the right level, those things can be very complicated, and they have to be thoughtfully done by someone with expertise and knowing how modern software works, how the installation is actually going to be done, and how your data and workflows in that software are going to interact. There is no getting around the fact that this is not the same as, here's a laptop, it connects to nothing, all your software is sitting there, nothing else can happen, you're good. It's important to know that none of the softwares that are going out there are necessarily good or bad from this perspective, just carte blanche. YouTube is something that, while a lot of places look at and say everything on YouTube is bad, if you're in the coding world, if you're doing a lot of work on things that are going to be directly applicable to the business world, to a lot of your skills in a lot of your tools are out in the business world, YouTube has a ton of good stuff. You cannot just say this is on, this is off. We have to be very, very thoughtful in how we do it. But this is only one piece of the problem. When we say we need to thoughtfully evaluate it, we need to be thoughtful when we're thinking about data security, that this is really a human problem. This is a human problem of, how does the intended user make sure that they're in the right place? How do they get the data they should be having? How do they deliver it to the intended recipients, whether it be your student, whether it be your parents, whether it be outside specialists? The most important part of data security is not just the cybersecurity portion, which is a good big piece of it. The bigger piece, which is where thoughtful, deliberate attention to detail comes in, is that is this thing being used right? I mean, is this something that we can put all the thought we want into, passwords that are completely impenetrable and are changing every 30 minutes, but are they not just going to get written down on a Post-it note that sits on the back of a computer? We have to be really, really thoughtful about the human interactions, especially considering the reality is more than 8-to-1. Any of your data breaches, which is data goes to the wrong place, the way we've used it, that data has been confused or compromised, that more than 8-to-1 is happening by human error in general. And in the school space, it is way more than 8-to-1. There are very few Russian hackers sitting somewhere thinking they're going to come in and get something great out of the third grader's classroom. The threats are not out there to the same level as the error rate is going to be what drives whether or not the information that should be going from one party to another, from the classroom to the specialist to the parent, whether that goes the right direction. That human issue, human operational piece is your big concern. And it requires a rethink of how we actually look at our tools, how we actually consider the threats that are real threats we need to be worried about, and how we go about solving them. The way we always recommend is this needs to be looked at from a risk perspective of, our objective is some tools are going to provide are going to be high risk. We want to keep moving as much as we can down to low risk. This does not mean we can eliminate every error. There will always be communication errors. There will always be some error of some piece of data goes the wrong place. There's always going to be, especially when we're using email, it's almost unavoidable. If you're using email for systems to share sensitive documents, the quick advice is don't. You should find some other economically accessible alternative that reduces the probability that something could go wrong, especially when we're dealing with things like an IEP, things that are going to be evaluations, things that are going to have a significant consequence of being released. So if that piece of data is not something you'd be happy, tacking on a light pole and letting anyone come by and see, you need to start thinking about ways that we can reduce access to it, but we need to think about how that access is being gained smartly. And there isn't an end state where it's going to be perfect. It's important to understand we will never be perfect in this. Risk will always exist anytime we're sending around documents, anytime we are having an important, significant collaboration. There will always be a risk that something will be missent, misunderstood, that someone will see something they shouldn't. But it's your responsibility, it's all of our responsibilities to take a look at each of these things that could be of consequence and reduce them down to a level of risk that everyone can say, that's the best we can do for the money we can spend. That one is reasonable. That's the strategy we should be looking at. And if we look at every piece of data and how it could go out and how we control and manage it, we're going to be fine. This isn't going to be a thing where we have to have a $800 million spend to fix everything and, throw out the baby with the bathwater here. We just need to be thoughtful and with an attention to detail of what we're doing. What that comes down to primarily, which we'll hit on a few items here, is number one, most important, we need to be using the right tool for the right job. There are a lot of really cool technologies, standard technologies, things that have existed for a long time. We've used them a certain way because that's what we had, and that's what we keep using. Word processing softwares, those are archiving tools. Those are things where if I know what I want to write and I can write it down, it's easy to see it written down. It's very good. If I start getting into things that are going to be, web-based collaborative word processing tools, again, if everyone's on the same page and we're actually writing towards a shared outcome or writing towards a shared goal, it's a reasonable tool. But if everyone has different interests, if we're actually negotiating, if we're actually collaborating, it's probably not the best tool anymore. That's no longer the right tool for that job. Email. In general, the internet was developed by a bunch of engineers in basements who all knew and trusted each other and wanted to send stuff faster. If you start ending up with situations where I may not get this to the right place, I may not trust everyone in this network, there may be different agendas in here, we need to start thinking about how these tools were built and whether or not the construction of the tool is now appropriate for the environment we're looking at, appropriate for how we're using it. For example, the first piece of saying, can the tech even do the job it says it will do in a human context? Now, every piece of tech is going to have a package that has a list of, almost ingredients on the back. So, oh, we've got this and this and this and this. And a bunch of them are going to be things that you have no idea what they are. Even in the tech space, there's so much jargon. You sometimes have to, Google it to figure out what does this thing actually mean it thinks it does. More importantly is when it's used by humans, will it do what it says it will do? Video conferencing software, for example. There are some, depending on how they're set up. Now, there's been a ton of articles on Zoom bombing and Zoom hacking and all this other stuff that's theoretically wrong with Zoom. Those are human errors, primarily. Very few of those were fundamental issues. The issue where they're saying, oh, Zoom's selling all their data to Facebook. There's an option where you can log in with Facebook, use your Facebook as your credentials for sign-on, and yes, there was some significant data sharing there that was probably inappropriate. There were some developer tools for integrating Zoom with Facebook, and yes, there was some stuff that should not have gone back and forth there. You shouldn't be using Facebook if you're doing something sensitive. That's hopefully, hopefully that isn't an outrageous new comment, but if you're doing something sensitive, you should not be logging out Facebook in general, right? However, in the construction of some video conferencing tools, if it's difficult to see who's in the room, if it takes multiple steps to figure out what other people are doing, seeing, looking at, if there's some that will only show you someone's screen if they're talking, if I'm in a room where I have to manage the expectations, the feedback, the input from everyone in that room, and in video, I'm already losing out on that ability to have a side sigh means something. My hand gestures, my hands right now are going crazy and none of you can see them right now. To miss out on those nonverbal cues already is important. To have a system where we can't even immediately know, for example, that someone joined the room that may not have been allowed to be in there, that is a situation where the tech is unable to give you a secure room. If you cannot be 100% certain in the way that tech works, that you don't have just some random person that's walked in, if anyone off the street could walk into the room and sit in that IEP meeting without anyone noticing them, that would be a really big failure on the part of your physical organization. we have to consider whether the virtual world we set up provides that open door that others can get into that's going to be easy for them to move into. There will always be a situation where something goes wrong. Someone may send the invite somewhere. A password that's sent via email is always going to have access to compromise. Yet, some tools make it much more difficult to verify very quickly with a scan who's there. That is the tech being unable to do what it says it will do. The next piece is, are your people trained to operate it? I don't know if anyone saw this commercial from a while ago where the one lady thinks that her Facebook wall is where she puts her pictures on the wall. There is a wide range of technological expertise, experience, and comfort with the tools that are going to be used here. We work a lot in the court system with virtual technologies, and there can be things as basic as how do you make sure you stop showing your nose hair to like, oh, did you know that the microphone's in the bottom left? I mean, if you need to unmute was a game, I don't know how many of us could actually make it through the day on that thing. But the important part is there is a first level of is the tech able to operate? Next, are your people trained to operate it as is intended to just operate in general? Can they find the right buttons? That's where a lot of us are right now, especially in the court space, the legal tech space. Right now, people are trying to find the right buttons, and that's important. We're in for what many is a crisis situation where the world has flipped on them. Finding the right buttons is important. When this wave comes, the more important piece, though, is are they trained to effectively use it? Communicating virtually, because we're losing all those nonverbal cues, is a very different communication culture. We need to be ready to speak in shorter bursts. We need to be ready to take those shorter bursts and marry them with the written cues that can make up for a lack of ability to see things that we would otherwise see in the room. We have a different way we need to look at the use of the tool in order to be effective in our use of it. And that takes training and practice. And there are known ways that we can actually effectively use these tools best. There are best practices. We work with a lot of organizations to help them understand what are the pluses, what are the minuses, and how do I actually use them to my benefit. In an IEP meeting, for example, where there can be significant imbalances in both power and information, video actually can be a very effectively used tool for rebalancing those rooms to make the meetings more collaborative and more effective if we rethink how that meeting should be structured. But it's very important that we re-look at how we use the technology within the room we're provided. And last thing the second to last thing, do you need to accept some logistical risks? For some people who've been lucky enough to have a brand new building, they might throw in some great new solar, some place that does water capture, or you might have chains instead of gutters, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of cool things there. But then if your maintenance staff goes and addresses those all the same way, if they roll out all of our solutions to up maintenance the same way, we end up in the same problem. The virtual world is no different. There are going to be different ways that needs to be set up, maintained, and operated that in some cases, is there a way you can offload some of that risk? Is there a way you can actually partner with organizations that are able to make sure it's set up correctly so that those who are specialists in education can deliver that specialized support in an environment where they know the environment will work? This is a massive conference with tons of things going on. Susan and I did not set all this up on our own, right? They told us, here's where you go. We've scheduled you. Here's your link. And they've made sure that everything's set up correctly. Are your teachers and staff set up to do that? Number one. Number two, is that a risk that you need to take when there are other ways that you can actually execute the logistics of those meetings, the logistics of working in itself is something that needs to be thoughtfully considered. And last piece is, digital dispute avoidance is different. Calming a room, making sure that everyone's on the same page in real life and face-to-face is one skill that a lot of people have over time. And when we get used to people in education, we're very face-to-face people. We almost need to have that person with us to make sure that we understand how they feel, how we can respond, how we actually avoid disputes with them. Again, this is something that everyone is struggling with in the dispute avoidance world in the court system. Is there is a different approach to avoiding disputes in the virtual world. And just because you're good at working together in real life doesn't mean that we should be translating all those keys. We should be looking to see, can we incorporate either training to make sure that our individuals are trained in the techniques of dispute avoidance that is relevant to the digital world, or can we actually just insert an expert that can actually help us? Facilitate IEPs are very, very useful. The data shows that they're a very good process. Making sure you're offering that in situations where you are digital, where disputes are more likely to arise through miscommunications because of this new digital world, finding individuals who can actually provide that support that are trained in how to do it in a digital environment is something that should be thought about. Can we train up individuals into what's in the legal world called ODR, online dispute resolution? Can we train up people who can do that in our district? Or should we look to bring in experts to avoid what becomes the unavoidable costs of a conflict that didn't need to occur because of digital miscommunication? If we take these pieces and evaluate them thoughtfully with attention to detail, what we hope we can do, because again, the wave isn't here, it's coming, but there is time. We need to make sure that the choices we make don't paint ourselves into a corner. We need to be thinking about where are we going to go, what are the ups and downs of this tech, and how can we make sure that when we see here's where we think the world is going, which is what we'll hand over to Susan, is we aren't making choices now that paint us into a corner as we're moving forward.
Thank you, Chris. I know it's really challenging to think about how we actually move from in-person meetings to virtual meetings, and all of those, I hope, are pieces that we consider as we move to that. I'm sure by now you have all seen a couple of blueprints on getting back to what school will look like in the fall. AEI has released a blueprint. They're a think tank out of Washington, D.C. that I think is the most helpful and comprehensive look at how to support special education students, especially with the move to virtual, and especially when you come back either late summer, early fall, whatever your state is looking at. So we know that these students are going to need accommodations and additional support, and we must plan for them now. So some of the recommendations that came out of this report were specifically around assessing student needs. So this first priority will be getting students reintegrated into school. And so your district needs to consider the variety of diagnostic assessments that can be used for understanding where each student is academically, and also each child's SEL needs. They will need to be identified as the most vulnerable students and prioritize their needs through that. And then the next recommendation that AEI came out with is on the continuity of learning. So students with special needs and English language learners need accommodations and additional support. Those must be planned for now to ensure every student can be served in the event of additional closures, right? We don't know what the fall will look like. Will there be a second wave? Will we close again? Will we go completely remote? Will we stagger our days? Will there be hybrid approaches? All of these questions are not going to be answered until we see what happens with this, sickness. So when you're thinking about special education students, specifically think about that continuity of learning, as it may and likely will be disrupted again. Then we also need to make sure that we are preparing our teachers, obviously, which is kind of the piece Chris just talked about, where we really want to make sure they can effectively do these meetings online. If the meetings are ineffective, if they can't have IEP meetings, if they can't do evaluations, it's only going to hurt our students. So the professional development piece, as always, this always is for whatever the issue is really huge for making sure that we support special education students when we do come back in the fall. Additionally, assessments and accountability can look different. We didn't really go into a lot of the federal stuff, which for the question portion, we're happy to go a little bit more into the waivers, funding / no waivers that we've gotten for special education. But essentially the loss of the 2020 spring assessments curtails our understanding of student progress and needs right now. And so students with special education can use assessment data to inform school interventions, improving instructional practices, and targeting resources to schools and students who need the most help. So there's a way, and even under ESSA, before all of this happened, where there's flexibility within the assessments piece. We need to take advantage of those assessments instead of end of year, which every state has gotten waived from the end of year assessments. We can look at those and say, we need to do a diagnostic. We need to do different evaluations. So as we're thinking about how to understand where students are when we do come back, whatever it looks like, really rethink the assessments and accountability piece, because there's flexibility there to ensure that we can understand what the student needs and where they are in their learning whenever we get back. And finally, we need to really focus on whole child supports. You know, we've all seen the statistics on increase in suicides and mental health issues. And so we need to really take advantage of some flexibilities that is now in the regulatory structure. And especially things like telemedicine. It used to be that providers, if they did a virtual phone call or an online, Zoom or whatever, they could not bill for that. And so doctors were less hesitant to provide telehealth as an option, but there's new flexibilities through the Center for Medicare Services, CMS, that now allows doctors to bill for telehealth. So there's a lot more options for students to get their therapies and do different things online that before doctors would have been like, as much as they're altruistic, they still need to make money. And so if they couldn't bill for those services, they would be less likely to use that. And there's also funding in the CARES Act, specifically for mental health, substance abuse, and different ways to really take advantage of those monies in a way that will support special education students and their families. So we will put the link in the chat to the entire blueprint. Again, it was created by AEI with a work group of several chief state officers and superintendents, and a really great diverse group of people who are looking forward to the fall and what education will look like when that comes. But these 5 specific points are critical for students in special education with IEPs, 504s, and really thinking about this outside of the box is what's going to help your students when you do come back in the fall. So this is not something that we can just put a Band-Aid on and move over. This is something that's going to impact us for the years to come. And like Chris said, the wave is coming. We're all going to be doing it. Just back in 2014, 0.4% of Americans were doing virtual learning of any sort. By this year, it's going to be more like 80%. And so we really need to make sure that that access and equity piece is visible, especially for these students who need extra supports, who need extra meetings, and for getting those teams around the table to communicate effectively as they start to make these plans to go forward, to ensure that there is higher academic achievement for these students. So those are a few of the concrete recommendations that we've seen that really speak to how we serve these students. And we are happy to take any questions that you might have, from moving your team to the virtual setting to other supports, or how funding can help during this time of transition.
And then I apologize initially. Susan, do you have the chat up?
I do, yes.
Oh, did we get any? Oh, sorry.
We've had a few questions that we already answered, but we can see if there's any more that comes in, or if anyone wants to let us know of a successful move to virtual SPED supports, we always love to hear those stories and think those should get shared among other district folks as well. So we'd love to hear from you if you don't have any other questions for us either. Okay, so we have some coming in. I'll try and keep up now. So engaging special education students is much more difficult due to their reduced independence. Yeah, so we've actually talked with a lot of parents about this and how to make them feel connected as they're schooling at home a lot. What's been really helpful that we've heard from parents is kind of a daily journaling process where they can write down what effectively has helped their student that day. Then they have a journal, and especially as meetings happen, either virtually or in person, the parent is coming back into the meeting and saying, this really helped on this day, this got him undistracted. There's a whole bunch of ways that they can go actually report back to the district since they're at home with them right now. So it's definitely harder to engage them for sure, but there are some strategies and tools that you can use to engage them while they are at home as best as you can. Obviously, we know there's limitations, but yeah, there's definitely ways to do that.
And some of the items that we're seeing that are working very successfully is how do we help make those baby steps, and how do we help allow those parents to engage when they're observing in a way that isn't intrusive, isn't something that overwhelms them. We understand, especially as you get into those that require more hands-on assistance, that there's just, you can't get those pieces done, but there are steps that can be taken ahead of time in how do we help parents daily journal, essentially. How do we help them effectively daily journal so they are able to develop those trends, even if it isn't directly applicable later, something that can keep them and give them tips and tricks to help them move forward effectively, not feel overwhelmed, and ensure the whole student is accounted for.
Yes. Okay. I am not the best chat moderator, so you guys will have to forgive me. What about training students on using the technology?
Quick answer is yes. And what we mean by, obviously by age it's different. In our house, we have 4 between 9 and 4. So the 4-year-old's going to have a little trouble logging in if there is a very complex login structure. If all of a sudden they need to remember an email with 56 characters for a user account name, that's going to be very, very difficult. However, as much as we can enable and ensure that better access for all levels of individual capability are accounted for, that should be something we're striving for. So at the same time, we shouldn't just look at, there's going to be a lot of households where the technological comfort of the children is going to far exceed that of their parents. We shouldn't just be thinking of this as a adult, child, disabled, non-disabled, those sort of challenge. We need to sort of get a little bit out of those silos as we start thinking about how do we ensure that our systems are able to account for the human where they are, account for their capabilities where they are, and reduce their risk of engaging with this tool, whatever it is. There's simple things from ensuring that maybe our warning items that are important decision metrics aren't red and green necessarily on their own. Some people can't see red and green differentials, which is a problem. Those little things are going to be not just, again, adult, student, individuals or not. There's going to be a whole range of things. We will not get everything. We will not account for everything. If we're dealing with a lot of dyslexic students, is your font appropriate for there is a special dyslexia font that can be used. Is your font appropriate for those individuals and the services you're trying to offer them? And that, again, is going to require a holistic approach, looking at the human first. How can the human receive, manage, and then transmit this data in a way that is going to reflect the desires of what the tool or the process is supposed to do?
Yeah, and I will say, adding on to that, there are a couple of groups that we're working with that are really trying to put together a package in the fall, like of a back to school going virtual for any segment that we need. So we're going to have one for students that will be, okay, you have a student who's K-3. What does that look like for going online? And then we have, of course, our special education. What does that look like for, or what does that look like? We have a school board. So we're going to try to offer this holistic package that as this becomes the reality, the training should be easily accessible as you start to really hone in on that environment as summer kind of comes to an end. We're at a unique timing, right? Where it's summer now, but we still really need to think about that. We had another question. Do you know if there will be any flexibility given to a SPED department during this time? In Michigan, there hasn't been given any flexibility like Gen Ed. Yeah, the state's hands are tied basically from US DOE, and the Department of Ed granted no waivers for special education. So at this time, there's none that are specific to special education. But what I do recommend is still looking at the waivers that have been issued. And I'm doing, not to plug my next session, but I'm doing a whole stimulus primer on some of those waivers on this track. But you can use some of those other flexibilities to still help you. Even that like telemedicine thing that I mentioned, that's not specific to special education, but still a way that can be helpful in supporting those students. So I guess you can't be mad at your states because their hands are tied at the federal level. So that's why there's no waivers or flexibility in those departments. Someone mentioned that the New York City DOE has been amazingly helpful, providing workshops for all teachers. That's amazing and rare. We've found that a lot of districts don't really have that kind of support. So other districts take note.
I think if you are feeling like you don't have a plan yet, or you don't have it all together yet, anytime you have a major shift, anytime you're going to see something, there is going to be a crisis phase. And, in all reality, in a lot of industries, we're there. When you're looking at sort of the judicial space, you're looking at the legal space. We're barely getting courts processing things now. So you're not behind. This isn't like there's a massive thing where it's, oh man, I should have had this done 3 months ago. There is still time to be thoughtful in these items. And it is important to know that these decisions we're making over, once we take a few breaths in June, once we get into July and August, once the return plans are in, we really do need to be thoughtful in that phase though. And I think this is going to be a busy end half of the summer probably with how do we find the best solution that will get the job done now, yet also be ready and not pigeonhole us for the future. So I apologize. It will be a busy summer for everyone after a few weeks of breath, but you're not behind where you are. The majority of districts and groups and organizations we're working with are right now just not even able to think much about more than what's the strategy we're going to use. The implementation of it hasn't really started for most yet.
Yeah. Yep, that's 100% true. We have a couple people asking about concrete descriptors and examples of fonts and diagnostics and things to use. For me, that is not really in my wheelhouse. I don't know, Chris, if that's in yours. But we do partner with people where we could get a follow-up sheet to you about some of those recommendations.
Yeah, and I always forget the name of it. I mean, the dyslexic font I was identifying, I believe it's called Dyslexie. It's actually a great website that walks through like the hows and the whats and the whys of it. It's something that is relatively easy to, with someone who actually knows the tech well, it's something that's very easy to install, relatively speaking, a lot of places. But again, there are set guidelines on how you would set up a system with respect to making sure it's fully accessible, and those guidelines are pretty well known, and so we can look at putting together some stuff. But again, working around, nothing there has really changed. The more important piece that isn't in the wheelhouse for everyone is how are people going to operate it is often far more important than is that button exactly right. There is a benefit to making sure that some of those detail pieces are correct, but making sure that you have someone who has their eyes on the global, the macro, the actual full system is much more vitally important right now.
And I would say too, with some of the tech offerings, look at if any of them have gotten in trouble with ADA, if there's any Office of Civil Rights violations. When you're picking your products that you're using to support, just make sure that you're picking ones that are in compliance. And I mean, that goes as far as website even. So there's been a lot of cases and districts being, well, or companies being sued because they're not in compliance. Yeah, if you want to do that, you can go to the Office of Civil Rights website. It's federal government, and you can look at the complaints and you can do searches on ADA compliance specifically. And again, that could be a link we share and put together for you as well, some of those helpful federal resources.
And keep in mind, some things, tech moves relatively quickly. So because a name showed up in the past doesn't mean they're always bad, right? I mean, Zoom, for example, there's a lot of new regulations on where data has to flow with respect to server locations. Zoom did not have that set up initially. They have it now. So especially, there's a lot of softwares that, number one, did not expect to be used as much as they are, and now they are. There's a lot of rules that have been getting refined. AWS, for example, on the platform has had a lot of modifications just recently that some platforms may not have fully implemented yet. So this is a very rapidly changing landscape. The legal system does have a lag on it. So it is important to look at those resources and make sure if someone's like a massive repeat offender, if you're seeing lawsuits for them constantly, you might want to dig into it more. But it is important to always be careful that just because something is there doesn't mean things haven't changed. It's a point where more thoughtful consideration and more questions should be asked. If your vendor cannot explain in a way that is clear for you, there's nothing wrong with walking away from that vendor. There is no magic to tech. This isn't something that is all of a sudden a black box and you have to accept a black box. If they can't explain how that data is controlled in a way that doesn't require an alphabet soup that no one understands, it's probably not right for you.
Yeah. Okay, I haven't really seen any other questions roll in for a couple minutes here, and we are almost at time. So we want to be really cognizant of giving you that 15-minute leg stretch between sessions, since you'll be here all day. So I thank you so much for your questions. Again, if there's resources that we can follow up with you on where to find those fonts, where to find those diagnostics, we try really hard to be kind of brand agnostic when we do our presentations. So if those can be helpful resources to you, we would be happy to follow up on that too. But we do hope this is helpful and got you thinking about some things that you can try and implement before the fall. And with that, I will hand it back over to Navi.
All right, thanks so much. All right. So on behalf of the entire team, thank you for attending today's Tech and Learning Future Proofing Your District Plan Conference. Special thank you to our sponsors, Catch On, Classcraft, FileWave, Global Teletherapy, GradeCam, Sanford Programs, and thank you to our association partners as well. Please join me in thanking our terrific speakers today, and I also want to thank each and every one of you for joining us and spending this time together. And don't forget to register for next week's Tech and Learning Roundtable webinar on Wednesday, June 3rd. Join Dr. Keisha Ray as she speaks with district leaders about security issues related to online learning as schools plan for next year, such as keeping data private, cybersecurity concerns, and monitoring online activity to make sure students are safe and content is appropriate. To register, please visit www.techlearning.com/events. We look forward to getting together with you all again in person soon. Until then, stay safe and healthy. The next session by Susan Gentz is titled Stimulus Primer. That session will begin at 10 a.m. Eastern. We'll see you then. Thank you.